Hello and welcome. Today I'll be walking through my on-head frequency response measurements using the ZMF Auteur Classics and comparing that to industry standard measurements. For reference, these Auteur Classics are an open-back dynamic driver headphone. I currently have the 2018 the Harman reference curve up. It's just there as a visual anchor for these other measurements. It's there just to set the scale. If I show this monster of a frequency response is how I actually hear my Auteur Classics. I'll explain how I got these measurements and come back to this curve later, but I want to hide and show industry standard measurements while we talk about some other things. Flip this around. Unfortunately, I don't know who I can give credit to for this measurement. It is not mine, nor do I know which measurement system was used. Although the measurements themselves do not look like they were taken using the new 5128 system. So a quick backstory. I first heard these ZMFs about 18 months or so at CanJam Chicago, and I remember sitting there listening to them trying to find the frequency response to have a better understanding of what it was that I was hearing. Unfortunately, this measurement did not exist back then. So when I was sitting there trying them, they sounded pretty nice to me. Now that I have the actual measurements for how I heard it, that first crazy looking green curve, it makes more sense why nothing stood out as being too far forward because everything is forward. Alright, getting back to this measurement being shown. Here's my 30-second summary of frequency response. It's a visual curve that represents how loud a headphone, IEM, or speaker plays a range of frequencies. In other words, we can show it as an XY graph of this frequency is played this loud. We can use this to better understand the relationship this headphone or IEM has for playing back bass, mid, and treble frequencies. I want to say again, the Harman reference is just there to act as a scale for these other measurements. So if we look at what's shown, there are some things worth pointing out. Then keep in mind that these values are specific to that headphone on that specific measurement setup. That said, the bass region looks rather flat up until about 1000 Hz. There really isn't a big bass boost like we would almost expect to see, and it looks pretty linear looking at sub bass to mids. When we look at the mid range, there is a little bit of a bump or a peak about 1500 Hz, followed by a dip at about 2000, and then another rise about 3000 for your ear gain region. And then the treble, there's a pretty sharp, strong dip at about 7000 Hz. I was rather curious how this frequency response matched how I actually heard it. And then over the last 18 months or so, that's what I've been trying to work on to recreate this curve using measurements taken on my head. So this process includes picking several different frequencies and walking through them individually to say, I hear this frequency this loud, and then compare that to the other frequencies. And then we can represent that visually, which is where this comes back in. So in this case, I have all the curves aligned at 800 Hertz, but this green curve is how I actually hear it. And if we were to put this headphone on somebody else's head, they would most likely hear it very differently. Right? That is to say, this curve is specific to how I personally hear or experience this headphone. Now, there are still some similarities and differences if we were to compare the two curves. In the bass region, I hear a pretty boosted bass at about 100 or 150 Hertz that the actual measurement does not show. If we fast forward to 1500 Hertz, there's a bump there in the frequency range. And I hear that, and that's shown in my measurements as well. That said, I have a resonance of some sort at 1500. So this peak is here for every headphone, every speaker IEM that I measure. So this is pretty specific to me. So even without it being in the frequency response, this area is already exaggerated. But moving past 1500, it looks pretty similar. There's a dip about 2000, a rise back up to 3000, and then a dip at 7,000, and then there's this thing going on, a strong peak at 8,500, followed by a dip at 9 and a strong recovery, a strong peak again at 9,500. This is not a one-off value. This has been repeated with multiple measurements and averages. So that is something that I actually do experience it with this headphone. Uh, okay. So how do these actual measurements come into play? Well, the easy answer is this is a visual representation for how someone is experiencing that headphone. And so with that, we're able to gain a better understanding of why it sounds like that to them. Right? These on-head measurements start to become more important when we look at using EQ to make adjustments or corrections. So the EQ filters that you and I would use for these two curves would be very different. Having the on-head measurement makes for a better starting point because it gives us a better representation of how we actually experience it. For demonstration purposes, I'll use AutoEQ to EQ the industry standard measurement, the black curve, to match the Harman target. I think this would be representative of how normal people would use AutoEQ. If I do that, so we'll switch this around. Right. So the resulting curve looks like this, the blue one, where it does seem to match Harman a little better. It's more Harman-like, especially in the bass, upper mid-range, things like that. But the AutoEQ program creates filters that would be specific to the initial starting curve to what the final curve is. So would it be fair to assume that the same filters would be okay to use for different headphones? Well, probably not if the idea was to still get close to this Harman target. The same EQ could be used on a different headphone, but you're going to get very different results because the starting point is so different. So I'll give you an example. Let's take these same AutoEQ filters and apply it to how I actually hear it. And I get something that looks like this. This looks like even more of a mess of what it was to begin with. And you might like this in a headphone, but I will say it's too much for me. Ironically, the overall balance isn't that bad, since everything past 1500 hertz is pretty well boosted. So by comparison, it sounds even, but it's still too much for me. That said, this is probably what AutoEQ is doing for you as well. If you don't really know the starting point for these EQ filters, then you probably don't know what the final endpoint is going to look like either. It might sound good to you, and that's really cool, but it's unlikely that you know what you're actually hearing. If we think we're hearing the blue curve, if I turn this back on, and we're actually hearing the red curve, that's a pretty substantial difference. All right, so then what are the conclusions or takeaways from this? The first one then, it's pretty unlikely that you hear the measured frequency response as we're used to seeing it. So you probably don't hear how it measures. I certainly do not with this headphone. Right, the second takeaway is I think I have a process to help people like me and you figure out how we can actually visually represent how we hear this headphone. And that gives us a better starting point to really personalize our audio. And then it's this final point, because of that difference in measured versus heard from the resulting EQ, auto EQ is probably not what you think it is. All right, before I close out this video, you may also find this interesting. There's something coming soon that we can work together on. I would be providing all the files required, and you would be taking the on-head measurements yourself. So you'd be creating this curve. You'd be creating this curve for your headphone, your IEM. From there, we'd be able to do the analysis and get a personalized EQ to match a target. Then we'd be able to compare a personalized EQ to auto EQ results and see what the differences are, if one sounds better than the other. If that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for joining me today. We'll talk more next time.